Paul's letter to the Romans has got to be one of the most seminal written texts that the world has ever seen. Its impact is incalculable, and it's important to observe that that impact has not been entirely positive. It's also caused a great many people pain and loss, and given some people in the world an impression of themselves that has enabled them to pose as God's chosen to dominate the rest of the world. Paul famously, for example, says at the beginning, the revelation of God throughout the past of the world reveals that all human beings, all human groups in particular, have fallen prey to the forces of injustice and sin in the way that they lived, so that, and this is the purpose he makes clear, no one has the authority as a group to be the judge, the ruler of any other group in the world. This is what the history of human injustice reveals. This is not actually something, for example, that the Jews of Paul's day necessarily needed to be told. This is something that we find relatively commonly understood among Jews of Paul's day. But it is apparently something that needs to be said to these non-Jewish readers in Rome, some of whom have apparently begun to imagine that they are entitled to be the rulers or the judges of others in their community and beyond. This way of framing the letter gives us important information that is often missing in a lot of Christian interpretation of the letter, both historically and now. What Paul has told us very explicitly at the beginning and reiterates later in the letter is that the people to whom he's writing are of a Gentile background. He's not writing to people primarily from a Jewish background. Many times Christians have interpreted parts of the letter as if Paul were railing against Jews about something they don't understand about God or about Jesus or about the law. But the way that Paul introduces the letter and then identifies his purpose at several points throughout the letter makes clear that he's not speaking against Jews. He's speaking to people from a Gentile background who have acquired certain tendencies that Paul sets out to address, especially for the sake of their life together. One of the highlights of this letter is what comes in a famous section, Romans 9 to 11, where I think Paul's pastoral purpose becomes especially clear. As we read that section of the letter, what it tells us is that some of the readers of a non-Jewish background are reacting to hostility that they are getting from some Jews in their life, apparently Jewish authorities, perhaps in Rome or elsewhere in the Roman world, reacting as if the way that their Jewish brothers and sisters are hostile to them because of the way they're living according to the gospel means that God is disowning them and replacing them with this new non-Jewish people based on their obedience or something like that. And so Paul is very clear to say that God is just not the sort of God that disowns people. God doesn't give up on any of God's family, any that God has gathered as God's family, God's chosen over time. And so at the end of that powerful section of Romans 9 to 11, Paul says that it may be true that these relatives of mine, some of them have become enemies of yours because of the gospel, and yet they remain beloved of God according to election because of the ancestors. They've been gathered as part of a family by God's work in the world, the spread of God's name, and God simply will not give up on them, and consequently you cannot give up on them either. It's a message of hospitality, even amidst hostility and the growing pains of a growing family. One of my favorite passages of Romans that clarifies the overriding purpose of the entire letter comes near the end in chapter 15. I'm going to group together here the first verse of that chapter and then a key verse that comes a little bit later in verse 7. So Romans 15, 1 and 7. So we who regard ourselves as powerful are in fact indebted to carry the things that are lacking of those who are not powerful, and not to be pleasing ourselves. Therefore, welcome one another, just as the Messiah also welcomed you for God's glory.